Welcome to this episode of the Challenge to Change podcast. Now, some of us find planning super easy to do. It's almost as though some people have the ability to plan actually built into their DNA. Other people, like me for example, struggle somewhat to plan. I need apps, reminders and lists in order to plan effectively. Perhaps you're like me. Food waste reduction also needs a little bit of planning in order to be successful. And, as you might have guessed, this podcast episode aims to help us focus on food waste by utilising a little bit of planning. But before we dive into food waste reduction planning, here's an interesting fact for you. Did you know that it's now a legal requirement for workplaces in England to separate dry recyclables, food waste and general waste? If you work for a micro firm, they do have a little bit longer to implement the changes. So, if you live here in England, do look out for those bins in your workplace. So it enables employees of the workplace to put their recyclable items, their food waste and their general waste into bins designated for that purpose. So make sure that you know which items belong in which bin. Using those bins correctly really does make a difference to our wonderful planet. Now, food waste of course is not fun, nor is it the most fascinating subject on the planet. But it does matter. It matters how we store our food. It matters how we choose to buy our food. And it matters how we deal with any leftover food. The food waste we create at home and in the workplace doesn't simply disappear when we drop it into the bin. If we want our food waste to disappear, or perhaps more realistically reduce, there is action that we need to take to achieve this. So what does that action look like? Well, the first point to note is to shop or not to shop. That is the question, to borrow a phrase there from Shakespeare. We have to work with what we already have in before deciding what to buy. Now that might sound pretty obvious, but I do know that in our household sometimes that isn't something that happens. We may find ourselves in a shop and then decide what to buy whilst we're in there, and then when we come home we realise that we didn't need the things that we bought. So it is really helpful when we're thinking about food waste to do it the other way around. Work from what you have in before making a decision about what to buy. It's so easy, isn't it, to be drawn in by deals and offers that we find in shops and supermarkets. And they can be really useful, but if you get drawn in by a deal for something that you already have in, then there's a really good chance that some food is going to go to waste. So try and use what you have first before buying more. Now, if you're really organised, you may decide to plan your meals for the week and only buy the items that you need to create those meals. But if, like me, you're not that much of a planner, it's always helpful to try and buy lots of store cupboard items. So these are the sorts of things that don't go off too quickly. Alongside those store cupboard items, it's useful to get things that will work in lots of different types of meals, so you've got that flexibility throughout the week. Another useful tip is to make up a meal from an array of perhaps unusual ingredients, or at least that's something that works in our household. I know that doesn't mean making a chocolate and egg sandwich unless that's something that's appealing to you, but it does mean using up what you have. We also have to be storage savvy, and this is particularly important. Sometimes food does get lost at the back of the fridge. And this can happen quite a lot. I think perhaps maybe because people have a tendency to put the new food at the front, perhaps because it's easier to do so. So instead of doing that, make sure that the food that needs using first is at the front of the fridge. And this will help us reduce food waste. You can also try labelling things in the fridge so that it's clear what those items are. If you have some salad that you purchase with the best of intentions, but then when it comes to eat it, it doesn't really seem that appealing, then maybe try having it with something that does seem appealing. Also, if your salad leaves are looking a little bit floppy, then you can reinvigorate them by simply giving them a rinse under a cold tap. There are also some other ideas to reinvigorate salad leaves on the BBC Food website, so do check that out. If you have some tomatoes that are overripe to enjoy in a salad or a sandwich, why not transform them into relish or tomato chili jam? Just look online for some recipe ideas. That's just a few options there to inspire you. But you can find lots more great ideas on the Love Food Hate Waste website and on the BBC Food website that I've already mentioned. Or you could be really old school and consult an actual physical cookbook. Don't forget, alongside storing your food in a logical way inside your fridge, it really does matter that you keep your fridge at the right temperature. The Food Standards Agency says that your fridge should be no more than 5 degrees. The rules of the fridge also apply to the freezer and the store cupboard. So think about what you have and make sure that the stuff that needs using first is towards the front and easily accessible. But let's stick with freezer storage for a little while. Always try to freeze what you know you won't use. If you purchase too much cheese, why not freeze some? Most hard cheese can be frozen. Visit the Love Food Hate Waste website for more information on this. In actual fact, many items can be frozen, even eggs. So look online for the best method for freezing eggs. Another important factor to note is that things don't last forever in your freezer. Granted, they do tend to last for quite a long time. The storage time varies depending on what you're freezing. If you buy something that is already frozen from a manufacturer, they will give you that information of when it needs to be used by. But if you freeze something that wasn't already frozen, check how long you can keep it in the freezer for. It's also really useful, as with the fridge, to label up the things that you have in the freezer and perhaps include that important use by date. Now it stands to reason that the freezer likes to be much cooler than the fridge. Again, according to the Food Standards Agency, freezers should be -18 degrees or colder. So that's something to keep in mind. So here's a few more storage tips to try and avoid food waste. Most fruit lasts for longer in the fridge. Bananas, however, don't do so well in the fridge. They will start to go brown if you pop them in there. This doesn't necessarily mean that you can't eat them, but if you don't enjoy bananas that are going brown, it's probably best not to store them in the fridge. Bananas will also ripen other fruit, and in fact, apples also ripen other fruit. So, to try and avoid that happening, keep bananas and indeed apples away from other fruit. And as already hinted, apples will last for much longer in the fridge. In fact, it increases the time that you can keep them for exponentially. Whole pineapples, though, should not be stored in the fridge, but once the flesh has been peeled and chopped, it's absolutely fine to pop it in the fridge in an airtight container. Moving away from fruit and back to eggs, it's super important to keep eggs at a constant temperature. If you can do that outside of the fridge, that's absolutely fine, but it's probably easiest to do that inside the fridge because If eggs continually change temperature, then they will go off much quicker. So before we move into the final section of this podcast episode, there are some podcasts that have been recorded previously that also talk about food waste, and I will pop a link to those in the description to this podcast. But I'm just going to share with you those episode numbers now. So episode 80, episode 51, episode 23 and episode 22 all talk about food waste in different ways. Now you can find all of those episodes on Podbean, you can find them on Spotify, you can get to them on Amazon Music. For episode 80, you can also find it on YouTube and actually watch that episode. So finally then, as we've talked about before on the Challenge to Change podcast, why not consider home composting? There are lots of really great educational materials about composting online. And in fact, why not head to YouTube and search Cheshire East Recycling Service for some videos from our wonderful Cheshire East waste reduction volunteers. We have some on composting, some on wormeries. They're a really useful resource to help you get started with composting, or if you're already a home composter, it has some really great tips to improve your composting process. There's even a composting playlist, so I will pop a link to that in the description of this podcast episode. So finally, to recap, if you live here in England, do look out for those food waste and recycling bins in your workplace, and don't forget to use them because it really does make a difference. Consider planning your meals and always work from what you have before thinking about what you're going to buy. Remember to use up your leftovers, and if you can't use them, consider home composting them. Think about your fridge, your freezer and your store cupboards, and make sure that those things that need using up first are easily accessible and identifiable. Don't be tempted to buy cheap deals unless you're absolutely sure you're going to use up what is on offer. Otherwise, it's not really that cost effective in the long run. I really hope you've enjoyed this podcast episode. Thank you so much for watching.